Welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have you with us this morning, or if you're in another time zone, maybe this afternoon, for our webinar on HR issues and employee ownership. I'm Amy Barris. I'm the Executive Director of RMEOC, or the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center. And some of you with us today, I know, are familiar with RMEOC, but if you're not, we are a statewide nonprofit organization that works to grow employee ownership in Colorado. And we do that through outreach and education and providing direct technical assistance to businesses that want to become employee owned. I'm going to do some quick introductions of our staff and presenters, and then go over a couple logistics before we get into the kind of presentation and discussion. So first, I just want to introduce Ashley Ortiz, who's with us. She is Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center's Technical Assistance Advisor. And then as our presenter today, we're really excited to have Jennifer Briggs. And I'm going to share a brief bio with you because her background is just so rich in employee ownership and organizational development. So Jennifer Briggs serves as a senior strategy consultant at the Rady School of Management, University of California, San Diego, in the Beyster Institute, proving that business can be done differently. Purpose-centered, mission-driven, and values-powered, using tenets of inclusive capitalism to attain success. She serves as an outside independent director for PFS Brands and Engineering Economics, and is a founding partner of Grit Business Coaching. She's a Rutgers University Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing Executive Fellow, focused on corporate governance and performance, a commissioner and vice chair for the Colorado Office of Employee Ownership, and a volunteer board member for RMEOC. She's contributed to the work of the Democracy at Work Institute and the Reinventing Work Initiative with the Boston Fed. She holds a Master's of Science in Organizational Leadership, Graduate Studies in Enterprise Project Management, and a Bachelor of Science in Community Health. She was a member of the New Belgium Brewing Executive Leadership Team for over a decade as VP of Human Resources and Organizational Development, and was the chairperson of the board for GIS Inc., headquartered in Birmingham, Alabama. So we're really, really excited to have Jen with us today. So before I hand it over to Jen, I want to just go over a couple quick logistics. First, our intention is that this is a really engaging and interactive session today. So we'll have different points throughout the time together where we'll be asking you for your input and engagement, and we hope you'll feel free to do that. If you have any questions or comments along the way, please also feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll try to address those as they come up or when we have a moment. And then we're also going to be using the annotation tool. So I don't know how many of you have used the annotate tool in Zoom before, but we're going to do a little practice because we're going to use that for some polling at some different places. So if you go to the top of your screen, you should see a little place that says View Options with a down arrow. If you click on that, you'll see Annotate in the drop-down list. If you click on Annotate, you should then be able to use your cursor to start marking up the page. So, does everybody see your options up there to get into annotation? Yeah, I see some people writing. Excellent. Go ahead and scribble a little bit. And then we're going to go on to the next slide and do a little practice. It is kind of cool, isn't it? We just discovered this. So we had a little poll that we wanted to have you do just to practice. So if you feel like picking one of these, the question is, would you rather confront a colleague at work, get swarmed by bees, or take a calculus exam? So feel free to put a little check mark or your initials or a circle around one of those. And if anyone's having trouble with your annotation and you need some help, just we can try to do that. Let us know in the chat. All right, great. Looks like people are getting it. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jen to get started with our content.
Good morning, everyone. It's fun to see you here. The other thing that I want to tell you, just in full disclosure, is I am fortunate to be on the board of the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center. And I see, Larry, you're on here too. So thanks for joining. And I have the pleasure of getting to work with Amy and Ashley and then also the State Commission on Employee Ownership. So we're all incredibly dedicated to this idea, and especially once we become employee owned, no matter what format it is, if it's a trust, cooperative, ESOP, whatever it is, we want to help those companies be as successful as they possibly can, because I think success begets more success. And the more we could tell the stories of all of your great work that you guys do in companies and with your organizations, the more we can help other people understand that this really is a much more viable option. So always excited about this. And when we talk about, so I am a huge fan of organizational democracy, and I'll tell you a little story about my experience at New Belgium. So I was there for almost 13 years. And of course, there's always the challenge of how do you measure culture? And it's really been popularized to be more about employee engagement. And so do people kind of care about the work they do? And that's important, right? But when we talk about organizational democracy, I think it goes hand in hand with distributed leadership. Is everybody in an organization empowered to make really good decisions? Are they empowered to think about long-term strategy and to be thinking over that horizon? Do they have the financial kind of lingo and some kind of basic knowledge to be able to understand what's going on financially in a company? So for me, it's really more about a responsibility culture. But when we looked, so I was tracking at the brewery, I did my own little internal longitudinal study of year over year. We had some measures, and I used the World Blue Freedom at Work survey. So we participated with World Blue. And I also used the NCEO's employee ownership survey. And I took 2 questions out of each of those surveys that really looked at both organizational democracy, where people included in the business of doing the business, and also with running the business. And then with also NCEO, how were people feeling like owners? Did they feel like owners? And what I found over the course of these years of tracking the studies, so I tracked our EBITDA, share value, of course, revenue and profit, job growth, how many jobs we added, all these wonderful, more financial statistics, and I mapped them right against those more cultural statistics. And what I found is every year where we had like really good share value growth, because if you're not familiar with ESOPs go through a valuation process every year. But we were successful for a lot of the years, but where we had double-digit or more share value growth, the years preceding that were always our highest in our measures of feelings of ownership and organizational democracy. So in other words, people felt like owners and they were empowered in the business, and we saw those share value growth. Now, if I was an academic or a real statistician, which I'm an entrepreneur and I work in business, so I would be asking, like, is that a causation or correlation? And I can't tell you. And I don't think anybody honestly could really tell you, but what I can tell you is it was a repeated pattern time over time. And what I can tell you is there are other studies that show, and a lot of these are available through the NCEO and Rutgers, that when companies have some form of participative management in how they run their company, we see better results. So New Belgium we just went a step further. Instead of saying participative management, we actually looked at organizational democracy. I love, if you guys have seen, I think some of you were with Rebecca Bowen and Amy and Ashley at the session on participative management. And I love Rebecca's framing of what organizational democracy looks like and how Dowie sees it. And I appreciate that. But I want to share my screen with you. I have all these things brought up for you. So This is a study that I did when I was at New Belgium. So we were, if you guys have followed that story, we were a little craft brewery, and then we decided to build a second brewery out in Nashville. And we're talking about hundreds of people, right? So this is a bigger business model. But even in the context of that, we were still very familial oriented in terms of like, how do we work? And so what I did is I did the study, I got worker voice involved. So the democratic process of like, how are we going to solve this together? And what are we going to do so that we don't become this super hierarchical organization as we grow bigger and scale up? And so what I found was that New Belgium really was acting more like a clan culture. So we weren't actually fully like, we had embraced the idea of a responsibility culture, but we hadn't. We were still acting very family-like. And so we loved this part, that high flexibility, a lot of individual discretion. We could move fast and we could do all those kinds of things. But in the clan culture, it was also adding some dysfunction in it. So you'd hear people time and time again describe themselves as family. And so to give you an example of how this manifested in the HR world for me, I shared this with Amy and Ashley. When I first started, I came from kind of a rather large corporation. And so in a clan culture, I was an outsider trying to figure out, how do I fit in here? And there was somebody on the team who was very toxic. And they were causing other people to not be as effective. But because this particular group was such a strong family, they couldn't, like that question at the beginning, they couldn't confront the person, or maybe they were having confrontations, but they weren't going anywhere. And that was true in this case too. And so I come in and seem like a corporate hatchet person and fire that person. And the culture, the team was very upset with me and was kind of helping me orient myself to this more clan-like culture, and said, hey, in a family, you don't fire family. And that's one of the things that you need to learn. I was like, wait a minute. Something I'm going to tell you personally about me is I was actually a foster child, and I'm personally divorced. And so I have been divorced by family. But I tell you that personal story because I think it shows the weakness in this metaphor of cultures being described as families. Is we don't all have wonderful families experiences. A lot of families have some dysfunction, and some people, myself included, might not even know what an actual functional family looks like. And so you're coming into these cultures and trying to understand it and trying to hold people accountable and responsible. And you can't, because of the closeness of the culture, because it goes there. And then to make things worse, because there was a huge and really great idea of transparency that we wanted to keep going. People wanted to know why I fired that person, and I wouldn't tell them. And so they thought the reason was because of my corporate background. And if you've ever talked to a lawyer, they'll probably tell you, keep these things private, which those are all true. But my reason for wanting to keep these things private was to preserve human dignity. If you've ever gone through a termination yourself, or if you've ever been fired from a job, or you've ever been laid off, it is a really bad experience. It hurts. And especially in a close culture, whether it's a cooperative, ESOP, or just a small family business, I think sometimes the pain can even be harder because you're being separated from your friends, you're being separated from that family. And so the pain can be quite intense, and it's really hard to adapt to. And a lot of times these are people's worst moments. And so my perception was the privacy was about helping that person recover from that moment, of giving them dignity of privacy in that moment, and that their coworkers didn't actually have the right to know, because I wanted to give them a chance when they went to their next step. Hopefully, we go through these times in our lives, and as people leave their jobs, a lot of times we learn a lot from it, and we're able to grow, and we're able to take the next level, and we're able to reflect. And I just never wanted any information to become public about that individual that would hinder their ability to move on and to recover and to learn from whatever happened in the workplace that caused the separation to go on. And so these are the challenges that I think went in. If you look at organizational democracy, or democracy in the philosophical terms of the words, it's the demos, the including of all. But then we all have to shape our own organizational democracies to make them into working, profitable businesses. So how do we do that? And the shape that it often takes is this familial type structure, which inadvertently can actually sometimes put tension against the real ideas of democracy and having a responsibility structure. So that's just a few stories around the framing of this and where my perspective comes from. And I think the ideas, human resources are, some of it's just the personnel tracking, like we got to log forms and check 1099s and do all that kind of stuff. But the other part of it is kind of a management function. And I don't literally mean that as a human manager. I mean, it's how we shape and run the business to make sure that we're doing all the things that we need to comply with. But even more importantly, how are we helping the company conjure excellence? How are we helping the individuals in the company be their best? And then hopefully in the anomalies, how are we exiting people who aren't kind of holding up to our standards of accountability? So just a little bit of a story and background there on where I come from.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share screens now. We're going to do a quick poll using the fun annotation tools that you practiced with. What we want to know today is, of the 3 topics that we advertised for with this webinar, we can definitely touch on all 3, but we just wanted to get a sense from you all which of the 3 you'd be most interested in. So feel free to vote for 1, 2, or 3 if you do want to focus on all of them, and just either circle, put a check, whatever you want. Let's just take a couple minutes. And then we're going to try to fine tune the conversation today to those of you here to make sure that we kind of, put the weight in the right area for why you're here today.
Huh. Looks like evaluations is getting a few circles.
I vote for all 3 there.
The more people vote, the more tied it looks, but it still looks like maybe evaluations is coming up first. What do you think?
That's what I'm seeing here too. So maybe we'll start with evaluations, Jen, if that works for you. Spend some time on that, and then we'll still touch on the other 2 with maybe a little less time hiring and letting people go.
Sounds good.
Great. Okay, thanks everyone for playing.
Evaluations, it's such a crazy topic because it comes up all the time, and I think it's because we do it so poorly. So everybody's always struggling with it. There was an era, I don't know, gosh, when would it have been, like early 2000s, that people are like, get rid of the evaluations, and then they snuck back into our world somehow. And even yesterday I was talking to somebody, and this is in the ESOP world, which the governance in ESOP is different from the governance in cooperatives typically. But in ESOPs, you have a board of directors, and one of those jobs of the board of directors is to evaluate the CEO and to make sure that ESOP company has a good quality of leadership, because usually quality leadership is associated with improving value of a company. So it's a really important role of the board. But if you ask most ESOP boards, they're not doing a performance review of the CEO, and most people will be like, it's painful to even think about doing a performance review of the CEO. So I think it's something that is mostly unuseful. And in large part, that's, I think, the reason why we don't do them. And so what I'm going to tell you now is more kind of my lifetime of learning, because I've designed some of the worst performance evaluations. They were incredibly useless. And I've also done ones that are incredibly useful. So it's been a lifetime of learning. So in most bigger corporations, what you'll have is competencies are a really hot topic. And I love competencies, actually. So I got certified in what's called the Lawmager. They're owned by Korn Ferry. I should have actually pulled out my book, but it's an incredibly useful thing. But what I found competencies to be most useful for, and in particular, that model, is for coaching. When you're having these challenges with somebody, either on a negative performance side, where they're overusing a particular competency or underusing a particular competency. So like action oriented as the competency, for example. So that competency overused can mean somebody's super reactionary, like they're getting a lot of like tactical stuff done, but they're not slowing themselves down enough to think strategically and think long term and to think things, because they're so strong. It's an overused competency. And likewise, underuse of action oriented could be they take too much time to ponder. They're only thinking of conceptual things and not actually getting to concrete things. And so I find it an incredibly useful coaching tool. But for performance reviews, I find them monotonous, bureaucratic, and utterly unhelpful. So part of the reasons for this is performance reviews. You guys have probably already heard of this, but the recency effect. And this is probably the number one reason why performance reviews fail, is if we do them once a year, which is typical, or even every 6 months, we do tend to have at most a 6-week look back. If any of you on here think about, like, how were you performing 4 weeks ago? What were you even doing? Now that I work for the university, I have to enter my time into Salesforce, and I'm constantly looking back at my calendar, like, what was I doing that day? I don't even remember. So how am I supposed to really remember what my performance was? And that's me as an individual. So put that into a managerial, or even if you're an open, flat organization, that we're supposed to even remember what any one of us was doing at any given time and how action oriented we were over the course of a year. It's just not practical from that perspective. So I'm going to share my screen again here. So when they're done poorly, it's a very cumbersome process, and that and when you combine performance reviews with incentives, that last one, it does teach levers for people to be more coin operated. So if I can check all the box on my performance review, then I can get a raise. And that just puts a lot of pressure on the performance review to be the tool for all things, and it's just not. And so in the good context, when performance reviews are done very well, it's actually part of the business planning process. So a performance review or an evaluation should really only be that. It's an evaluation or a review of something that we did. So if you guys like Deming, there's the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, PDCA. You're basically applying that as an evaluation to your own performance. So we make a plan for the business, and as a result, we have a plan for ourselves. And so we need to do stuff, and we need to show up in a certain way. We need to get certain things accomplished. And then we take some time and we're like, how well did we do? And that's really all an evaluation, a useful evaluation needs to be. It doesn't need to be the super cumbersome process where we're rating ourselves on competencies that may or may not have been related to the plan. It puts it in a place of where we are as individuals in terms of where am I at? Am I brand new at my job? And so my plan this year is basically just to learn how to do the fundamentals of a job well. Are we also evaluating ourselves on our organizational citizenship in terms of how do we show up as cooperative members or beneficial shareholders? So there's a lot of stuff going on in human performance that a performance review in terms of a form just won't capture. Another thing, one of the things I was able to do, I don't know if you've ever heard of Mountain States Employers Council, they just changed to Employers Council now, but we did a performance review panel. And so all these companies submitted some of us their evaluations, and we got to go through and redline them and talk about like what was wrong. And the number one thing that I was surprised at is these evaluations were trying to evaluate trustworthiness. They're trying to evaluate character. And if you're trying to evaluate trustworthiness or character on a piece of paper, it's a very unhelpful thing to do. And I kind of think if you're working with people that you don't think are trustworthy, and especially in the world that we all tend to work on in with where we're co-owners or collaborators on a thing of a business, if somebody's we're working with just can't be trusted, they probably shouldn't be with the organization. That should never even be an evaluation point. It should be out. And so I tell you this to like discern when you're doing an evaluation, you're just like, how did I do according to my plan? And how did my plan fit into the business plan? That's it. A corrective action is a very different process. It's the process of where you're saying like, hey, this isn't working out. Here's some of my concerns. Let's talk about how you can correct them. And then hopefully people are able to correct them and move on and do great work. Sometimes they're not, and so they have to be exited from the business. The performance evaluation is really just evaluating how you did against plan. So a typical business model is you do your strategic plan, you put together an action plan, then each person figures out like, what am I going to do to make this plan come to fruition? In close organizations, you'll probably talk about the responsibility-based behaviors. What are our norms? How do I show up in the organization? You do it, you get feedback throughout. Don't you give me feedback on what I did last year, because you can't expect for a peer to remember that. So feedback in this context would be, hey, I had this, I did this presentation. How did you think I did? Or even better, the idea of feed forward, which is something I love that Marshall Goldsmith has popularized. Hey, I'm going to do this presentation. What advice would you have before I go into the presentation? Hey, here's the financial reporting. I'm doing the budget, say, for example. What advice would you have for me to do a better budget? And when you get that kind of feed forward and advisory help, it's a much like emotionally safer way to get advice, but it's also more productive because people can be vulnerable in that perspective. It just kind of, I guess this is more of a curious question. Maybe we can do a poll on it, but the minute somebody says, I have feedback for you, like, what do you feel in your body? Do you like, oh, that's great. We try to say, oh, that's great. Like, oh, thank you. I welcome feedback. I bet probably 90% of the time when somebody says, I have feedback for you, you immediately feel like some kind of tension in your body. And that's what we get from the peer reviews. And peer reviews have also been found to be incredibly biased. People that we like and that are like us will give a more positive peer review on. People that we don't like and who aren't like that will tend to give a negative peer review. So they're just not useful, but that advice that we can get on incidents throughout the year are much better. So then what do you do for an evaluation?
Jen, real quick, if I can stop you, just maybe a little more expansion. Jerry had a question specifically just about your thoughts on peer input into evaluations. She put otherwise known as 360s. Wonder if you could just stop for a minute and expand on that.
Hi, by the way, Jerry. Yeah, so I think 360s for evaluation purposes are unhelpful, like I said. So I think Where 360s are valuable though, is when we're looking to, they're a very specific tool, and they're very helpful when maybe we're thinking about succession planning, or we're wanting to evaluate how are we moving into, let's say, if you have a more hierarchical like order to your structure, I'm thinking about moving into a different one. So they can be very helpful. They can also be very helpful for leadership. But again, these are more coaching opportunities and evaluation opportunities. So I think 360s are incredibly helpful for coaching. But for the typical small company where we're all just giving each other feedback, trying to help each other level up, 360s that are done periodically, one, they can be really expensive if you use a coach. And then two, again, we'll have the issues with the recency effect. So what I like better is for people to literally keep journals. You can keep them online, you can keep them in your email. But say, for example, I'm going to put Amy on the hot seat here because she's done this. But she's getting ready to put together the annual budget for Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center. And what she would do is, pick a couple of people who are really good at budgeting to help mentor and give advice as she goes into that. And then she can write that down and track it all year. And so then you use that information when you do your self-review, is you look at yourself and say, well, I really do think I improved how I budgeted this year. I changed these methods. This worked out better, blah, blah, blah. And it's a much more useful reflection on how you improved over the year than sending out your board of directors with the RMEOC, sending out a 360 saying like, how did I do on budgeting? If that makes sense. So the way, and this might be helpful too. So what I've come down to, so I've you have the forms. You can, if you think about downloading an evaluation form off the internet, just stop yourself, like resist that. No matter, like, the forms are just, they're for someone else, they're designed for someone else's business, they're probably not for you. And then if they say like to evaluate somebody's trustworthiness on a scale of 1 to 5, that's just a bad question. So the way that we did is actually a narrative review. So the first step would be to complete a self-review. And it's, how do I show up? How do I show up? Do I make a positive impact? And so what you see on the screen is the how do I show up is the question. And then the bullets underneath it are discussion prompts. So it encourages a place of self-reflection. Do I create positive tension? Are we debating things? Are we growing ideas and solution? If you are a values-based company, are your behaviors reflecting the norms of those values? How are you making choices every day? Every day, each one of us has to make choices, and our choices are at tension with one another. How are you resolving those tensions? And are you using the framework of your particular business to do that? The second question is, what am I capable of now and in the future? So am I a self-leader? Am I growing my skills? And this is so important, especially in smaller businesses, where we do have to put a lot more initiative on us as individuals, because we might not necessarily have the resources or the structure or the order of a bigger business. So am I growing? And as I look at how the company is growing or how our business is growing, am I working to adapt my skills in a particular area that's I'm going to be a good suit for? So it's really looking at capabilities. And then the next one is accomplishments, because we need to get stuff done. If we're cooperative, ESOP, small family business, it's still a business. So we're still trying to, address our customers' needs. We're still trying to be a really vibrant competitor in the market space that we inhabit. So does my work integrate with the work of others? Like, are the things that we're doing together creating results? Are my decisions that I make driving results? And if I have goals, I'm a huge goal person, did I make progress on those goals? And so you're evaluating yourself there. And then you'll have a conversation with whomever is, like, if you don't have a traditional managerial structure, then you have usually a small circle of people, and you're going to actually discuss this with the people and create a discussion on, are we calibrated? Are we aligned? Was my work really doing that? So it's just creating a framework for discussion. But again, if an individual is not coachable and they don't have a growth mindset, this process is going to be a big struggle for them. And it's probably going to be a big struggle for them being in any kind of cooperative or business like that. If all we want to do is be closed-minded and do the task at hand, they're going to struggle in this process. And then the other thing is, if somebody violates safety or emotional, like if they do any of that, that should never show up in a performance evaluation, because if it shows up in a performance evaluation, you're too late. That means you missed a big opportunity early on to say, like, hey, this is a really bad deal and we need to address it now. So I would always address, when people would come to me and say, like, hey, HR person, I'm going to have to deliver this bad review. It's like, well, why did you wait 3 months or 6 months or whatever it was to put it in a review? A review is just a review. It's not the point to surprise somebody on something that they should have been addressed in the moment. Those kinds of safety violations, critical issues are always in the moment issues, and they're not part of the evaluation. Now, where that can change, though, is if you're coaching somebody over time on patterns of behaviors. Patterns of behaviors is what we're looking for in evaluations or reviews, not critical incidents, if that's helpful. I'm going to pause here for a moment. Yeah, and I want to back to Jerry's question in there too. The other problem with peer reviews is, if you're a large company, it takes a lot of time. And I think you always have to really question, how much time are you taking in the peer review process versus the value that you're getting out of it. And so this kind of really, I love the Marshall Goldsmith method, like giving advice, jotting it down. That is much more active. It's the part of the active learning process. And then it just, over the time, it enables you to do a self review that is much more powerful, because you can look at your growth over a period of time. And it's really fun when it's one of the moments that HR is actually rewarding, is when people are able to look back at what they were doing 6 months, 9 months, a year ago, or even 2 years ago. And if you're with an organization long enough, you see people really come into their own, and you've actually done something to document it. You've documented that growth, or they've been documenting their own growth over time. And that is a place where performance reviews are really, really powerful, is if you can pull them out 5 years later and say, what was I writing about myself 5 years ago? And where am I at now? Those are really fun moments. Where was the business 5 years ago? Wow, we were small, we had 20 people. Now we have 80 people. And look what I was doing then, and look what I'm doing now. And so these are the moments to tell those stories of success. And oddly enough, an evaluation can be one of those tools that can help you do it. But if you printed off a form off the internet, those are going in a file somewhere that you'll probably forget about, because they actually had not a lot of power. So again, really becoming a self-leader is a really important aspect of this. Keeping input or a feedback journal, and then being goal-oriented. I want to show you a little bit about the self-leader stuff. So some of you might be familiar with the situational leadership, and Kim Blanchard is one of the people. Actually, he did a lot of the early research with some research partners, but they commercialized it. They're probably one of the best commercializers of this research. But the thing about being a self-leader is you have to ask people for what you need. So when people are just learning something, like, you have to have that vulnerability to say, like, I need more teaching or coaching because I don't know how to do this. And when people are brand new at something, it's this low competence, high commitment. You're really usually super excited about it. So there's a certain task or goal that you're doing, and you need X amount of support and motivation to do it. And then the next phase is like, okay, well, I've kind of got that down, but I'm still not super motivated about it. So you probably have some competence, but you're low committed. So what you really need from the people around you or your manager is more support. You need more motivation to stick to it, because we go through these ebbs and flows. The next one over here is moderate to high competence. In other words, like, I got it, I know what to do, but I'm just demotivated right now. And so you need motivation or more support. The last one is high confidence and high commitment. And this is like where people and the business are at their most productive. If you are highly competent and highly committed on 80% of the task or goals that you do, the organization is going to be running super well, because people can do their jobs. They don't need a lot of oversight. You don't need a whole lot of management. This helps keep an organization flat, because people are self-leaders, and then they're asking for what they need, and they're always growing to this place. And so this is kind of fundamental to be able to do a good self-evaluation of, I was able to ask for what I needed at the given time. So I'll give you a practical example, which is kind of a fun example, but I don't want to make this sound trivial. But one of the people I worked with at New Belgium, her name's Andrea Di Matteo, and I think, Jerry, you know her too. We did these massive events as we got bigger. So they were a big strategic planning events. We'd fly everybody to Colorado. And she's a good example in this particular task or goal of doing these events. She did them when the company was tiny, like when it was like 50 people. And then all of a sudden now she's running events for, 700. And because we had an open and transparent culture, we always invited a ton of feedback, and everybody had a whole bunch of opinions that of course were conflicting with one another. So you can't do anything right, because there's all these opinions, and she's just trying to do her best job. She's highly competent at running events. She's done them over and over and over. So I've repeatedly seen her ability to do this. So I know that she has that high competence as her boss in this case. She called me up on the phone, and she actually said we developed code words around this. So she's like, D3, 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 which meant I'm highly competent in what I do, and I feel like I'm failing. So I need you to support me. And so I knew the minute we used that shorthand code D3, and the reason was this is development level 1, development level 2, development level 3, development level 4. So you could develop any code words you wanted to, but these are actually pretty boring. But I knew that moment, I was like, put stuff down, take a break. We actually went to a restaurant and we just talked. And we talked actually not about the event. I helped separate her from all the noise. I helped her remember how far she's come, how good of a job she's doing. And so what that meant to me is I need support. And so it's an incredibly helpful way to get the things that you need from the people that you're around. I'll give you another example of this, maybe as a full cycle. So I'm going to use snowboarding as a pretty easy one. So if you're just learning how to snowboard, you're probably really excited about it, right? So you don't need anyone to motivate you, because you're psyched. You're going to go, you're going to take lessons, right? So you're getting direction and teaching from somebody. If you're just learning to snowboard, or you've gone through this, you know that you get demotivated pretty quickly, because you fall all the time and your body starts hurting because you're falling. You can't get off the ski lift. So you quickly go to what is D2, because you're unmotivated and you're unskilled. And so you just want to quit. So what you need from your coach at that time is you need somebody to motivate you, to keep you going, especially if you're taking like a day-long training thing. Like, you need that person to come to you and be like, no, you can do it. I know it's painful, but you got it. This is fun. And they need to remind you, those good coaches remind you why you're excited about doing this in the first place. And then over time, you're actually going to get pretty good. So you need lower direction. You need that coach to back off a little bit and let you try. This is the active learning process. It's like, hey, I've got it. I'm trying, I'm getting down the mountain, I'm falling, but I know they're there. I'm going to get back up. So active learning is a big part of this phase. And then over time, you're going down, you're getting on bigger hills, you're stretching your goals, you're getting to another levels. And so this high competence, high commitment is really where you level up and you go a level higher, because you get really good at that, like bunny hill. And then you can go to the next harder hill and the next harder hill and the next harder hill. And before you know it, you're going down blocks and you're just really good at it. So that's just another like more kind of practical example of how this is. But what they found in this research is this happens over and over again. And so when we can apply it to the workplace and we can apply it to evaluations, it gives us a really powerful framework to say, wow, on this, for our business, the thing that I was going to lead this year was I'm going to put on these monthly lessons. Wow, we got 32 people to enroll, and what am I going to do to improve? Or, wow, I feel like that didn't go that well. So Ashley's going to ask Amy, like, hey, I need some support. I need you to keep motivating me because we're going to stay on this. We're going to do it. We're going to get excited. And then that informs your self-review over time. So you don't have to do 360s because you're getting the on time, all the time feedback as part of your process as you become a self-leader and become really good at your tasks and goals. And then probably the more important one, especially if you're scaling up a business, is you're looking at, I'm at D4, can I mentor other people, or how can I take this to another level? And again, I use sports metaphors for that one. Like my daughter, her job title was volleyball player since she was like 5. She went on, she played NCAA Division II volleyball for 5 years. She redshirted her freshman year and went for 5 years. Her job title, even though it was volleyball player for her whole life, the job changed because the conditions changed that she was doing it in. And so this is the leveling up process time and time again. How do I get better? How do I undo maybe some habits that aren't serving me well anymore? Her college coach actually had to put a board on her elbow because she had this weird, she could hit harder if she didn't have this weird bend in her elbow. So in order for her to level up to even the next level, she had to unwind some old habits. But again, that's part of the whole evaluation process of, wow, you're here, but if you want to go to the next level, we need you to do this. And using this as a process to continue to evaluate yourself, to push yourself. I want to say push yourself harder, but I mean that in a good way. Push yourself in a direction that is going to get you to the next level, not in something that's kind of unnatural for you. Then when you go back to this process of the self-evaluation, these questions help you answer those things and help have a conversation about it. So you're constantly calibrating. Here's where I am. Here's the potential that I have to go. And here's the things that I got done. 3 questions. That's it. And also if you keep it to 3 questions or maybe 4, but probably definitely no more than 5, people need to be able to say what they're being evaluated on. So, Andrew, if I looked at you and said, like, what are you being evaluated on? Well, I'm being evaluated on how I show up in the workplace. I'm being evaluated on my capabilities now in the future, and I'm being evaluated on what I got done and what results I produced. That's easy to remember, easy to say. And if you go in any business and ask an employee, how do you measure your performance? I bet you very, very few people could tell you in a simple 3-pointed statement, and they probably give you some long-winded thing about, this or that. Well, that's not going to be repeatable and effective. So the more that we can repeat these things over and over again, and it'll be much more helpful to people. So, phew, that was fast, or that was me. Hopefully that doesn't sound like a word salad. Hopefully it sounded helpful to you guys.
Yeah, and that's great. Thanks, Jen. And just with an eye to the time, I'm wondering if you could switch gears to talk some about hiring, the ideas that you brought today. That would be great.
Yes.
Again, I'll just, sorry to jump in, but again, I'll just remind folks, please, I don't know if we have a raise hand function, but go ahead and throw questions in the chat as they come up so that we can try to direct those to Jen and get your questions answered as well.
And just a note to that, we'll try to leave about 10 minutes at the end as well. for questions. So you can hold on to them or throw them in the chat box anytime.
Oh, hiring is such a fun thing, isn't it? I think in our businesses, when I say our businesses, what I mean by that is us collectively. We're employee owned or we're small, closely held, whatever fits more with what you're doing. What's important is when you're hiring people, we're also hiring our future stakeholders or shareholders with us. And one of my biggest frustrations of the world of work that I wish if I could reinvent something, it would be to get rid of this idea, this kind of atomic unit of jobs, because that's what we do is we hire for, a job. I'm going to hire a brewer. And which is important because we need people with certain specializations to accomplish certain tasks. So that's important. But usually, especially in employee-owned companies, there's this additional layer that sometimes gets put on top of it, but I actually think it should be more fundamental, is we're hiring our future co-owners or we're hiring stakeholders in our business, and we need to hire for that first and then hire for the technical aspects second. So what does organizational citizenship look like in your company? And kind of getting to the definition of that and using that as a basis of some of your behavioral interview questions. And then going into the more technical aspects of the tasks, because really somebody's job is, back to the evaluations, is I'm not only going to do these tasks, I'm going to help my new colleagues, be really good at their tasks too. We're going to integrate our work. We're going to work together as a team because we're going to grow this organization together. And so many times job interviews are very tactical. And I think getting bigger about that idea. Now, one of the things I used to say that I've completely changed is I would say hire for cultural fit first. I've completely reversed course on that. And how I've reshaped that in my head is to hire for mindset. So, if you love reading about this stuff, having this open-mindedness or, the thought that you can grow, there's been a bunch of books written about it, of when you have a growth mindset, you can do a lot more. When you have a limited or closed mindset, you're very specific in like, I can only do X, Y, and Z. And it's a different fundamental belief on growth. You can find tons of webinars on that idea, especially related to children, but there's also a certain aspect of it. So I feel like, especially in our small companies and small companies that want to be growth companies, is having that kind of open mindset first and foremost. Culture, and I think we've seen it over and over again, is when we've hired for culture fit, we've reinforced the dysfunctions that are already in our culture. Worse yet, we've reinforced biases that are already existing in our culture. So I love the idea of team interviewing, but I also think there has to be a governance aspect to that team interviewing to make sure that there's not some kind of implicit bias in that process of doing that. I'll tell you like a kind of silly story of when I found it is this was again at the brewery, but we were hiring for a forklift driver in our warehouse. So a lot of logistics, moving beer around. We, I think, did a really good job at the behavioral interviewing, like trying to figure out, like people sometimes would have to interview 3 times because we weren't just hiring to get somebody on a forklift. We were hiring somebody who wanted to be a part of the growth of the company. So we got all those things right in terms of how did we interview and the use of behavioral interviewing. But when I checked in, so that they had autonomy, back to that self-leadership, they had the motivation, they had the skill set, I thought, to do these group interviews. So this particular hiring team was challenged between 2 candidates. And so we're discussing like person A and person B, and they were very different people, both wonderfully qualified. And one of the people actually finally said, like, hey, who would you want to sit down and have a beer with? That's who we should hire. And that was immediately like the point I put on the brakes. Like, no, like we need to hire people that are going to challenge us. And that idea that who would I want to have a beer with? I have a lot of friends that I love to have beers with that I would never want to work with. So hiring again for the family culture, I think we really need to look at who do we want to hire who's going to challenge us and push us in different directions? Who do we want to hire who's not like the rest of the team? Again, with this kind of growth mindset, staying fundamental, that's like ticket through the door. But then when you're looking beyond that, who's going to complement us? If you're a believer in discs or pick any personality assessment type thing, like somebody who's actually different than me, that's going to push me into areas of thinking, people who aren't like me, who are going to bring something new to the ideas of the organization, while also staying true to what you need to deliver as a service. So to give an example of that distinction, say you're doing a lot of retail work and you're interacting with the public a lot, that you might end up having a whole lot of people that are just really good at that. So you need to make sure you don't necessarily want to hire a wallflower who won't talk to anyone because they're different. But I think also really like, what can we do? Because this person is really good. Maybe we need somebody. I think of my son actually has Asperger's. And so this is where we can get into neurological diversity of maybe we do need to challenge ourselves on what customer service looks like. So I think when you're going through these hiring processes, you can genuinely challenge yourself on, why do we feel like we need that? Do we need only extroverted, very vibrant people in that front of the customer service desk? Or do we need something else in terms of how we're going to deliver services? And so group interviewing, I think, can really be a place to challenge, what are we doing? Are we doing the right things? Do we just keep perpetuating the same thing that we're doing all the time through our practices? So it's a wonderful time to kind of audit your organization. But bottom line is, group interviewing is really good, getting different perspectives in the room, using behavioral interview questions for people to find out, like, not yes, no questions, like tell me about a time when, is basically a behavioral interview question. And then doing multiple interviews to make sure that you're getting it right. Because again, if we're this closely held cooperative or employee-owned company, these people are our future shareholders. So we're not just hiring somebody who's going to do a task, we're hiring somebody who has the potential to take us to the next level of that. And so some of those questions, those behavioral interview questions, need to be really some about doing the task at hand, but more fundamentally about, how do I become a citizen of this organization? But just be really careful about that fit. I always think there needs to be someone who's an objective, I'm going to call them outsider, but it could just be outside the team, to make sure that you're auditing the process and making sure that the process itself has some kind of governance, so you're not inadvertently hiring people that are like you, or you're hiring people that you're going to be comfortable with, because the idea is not to be comfortable with people here. The idea is to hire people that want to be part of your responsibility culture, that have a passion for your business and products, that are excited about the potential. And that's really fun. And especially if you're hiring entry level jobs, I think those are the most challenging and most fun to do, because you don't have as many discrete skill sets. Like if you're hiring for a CFO, there's certain things a qualified CFO needs to be able to do. Entry level jobs, there's so much more potential for thinking about, what does the organization do? How do we shape how our customer service is? And there's a lot more challenges. And so that puts more pressure on that hiring to look at, how do we shape the organization? The more technical a job gets, it's kind of, or the more very specialized technical things. I've worked in an organization that had such a highly specialized thing. It got really, really hard to do, because you needed somebody who had network experience, who had certain coding technologies, and oh, by the way, they had to have certain clearances and licenses with the government. So there's an exception to every rule. But I don't think most of us probably have that kind of really finite skill set. And it's always fun when you get to grow people inside the organization. So that growth mindset, I think, is really important, because we get to be people builders and talent builders and really help and support each other. So I don't know if that's specific enough, because behavioral interviewing seems like, kind of, even as I say it, kind of a canned euphemistic answer. But I think the nuance of that comes in how do you design your questions and how do you design the process. So one of the things I love is, like, if somebody, you can bring an applicant in, maybe you've interviewed them, kind of done the initial screening, so they've checked the basic boxes. You bring them in, they actually spend time on site, they get to meet people, because any interview should be a two-way discussion. They should be interviewing you as much as you're interviewing them. And so if you're the interviewer, you're on the panel, and you find that your panel is talking 80% of the time, you're doing a bad interview. The candidate should be talking 80% of the time, and they should be asking you some really interesting questions, not challenging questions, but maybe, those questions about, what is the character of this organization? Tell us about your growth. They should be asking you questions. And if they're not, I think it's good, especially with people new to the workforce, to help them ask you those questions. That's completely okay. This is where sometimes lawyers, because I work for a very large organization now, they will say, repeat the same questions over and over again, and you can't ask any ones. But what they're trying to do there is ensure that there's fairness in the process. And so I get that. But what it disallows you to do as an interview panel is to be able to answer following, or be able to ask questions that follow those questions. So maybe someone said something really interesting, and that sets off this chain of conversation. The problem with doing checklist interviews is it might ensure fairness, which is a good thing. So we want to be fair, but we also want to find amazing people to work for our companies. So don't inadvertently limit yourself to something that's super routine because a lawyer told you to. I'm not a lawyer, by the way, if you guys have figured that out. But I will tell you, like, from a lawyer perspective, if you've never heard this before, the thing you should always remember is, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So even whether it's interviewing or evaluations or something, somebody comes back and says, hey, I was treated unfairly, make sure you're documenting it so that you can say, like, no, wait, this was a fair process. This was the process that we used. And I think this is also important for promotions. When you're promoting somebody, you can say, like, wow, this person knocked it out of the park year after year. And this was the reason why, when the promotion came available, that they were the best candidate for the job. So don't always look at it as a punitive way of, we need to track all the horrible things people have done. We also need to track all the wonderful things that people have done. And hopefully that's 90% of the work that we do, is looking at the wonderful things people do.
Jen, you talked a little bit about how hiring in an EO company might be different than in a traditional company. Is there any kind of overall thought you might want to add, or other aspects that you haven't touched on that would be different?
I think the main difference, if you haven't done it already, and I can't remember, I think Rebecca might have had some of these materials, but is really get clear on what organizational citizenship looks like for you as an organization, and use that to design your questions, those behavioral questions. Being an employee owner or worker owner, whatever you call it for your organization, is going to come with some aspirations. And so what are those aspirations relative to your business? And then how do you turn them into questions? But I think that's just one of the most fundamental thing, is we're hiring for the future, as well as, trying to take care of these tactical now things, and then getting other people involved. But also be careful not to get too many people involved. When I interviewed at the brewery the first time, so this was way back in 2004, they sat me at this really long table. This is like not how to do an interview. This really long table, super long table. And I think there was like 10 people. And they went person by person by person, asking me a question, and they sat me at the head of the table. So it was, let's try to, maybe this was part of their strategy. I never asked them, but like, let's make her really uncomfortable. I like interviews that really help someone be comfortable, because we want to really understand them, and we want them to understand us. And so if you're creating an interview situation that puts people on edge, you're not going to get a really good interview out of that person. And there may be some jobs where it is appropriate. I've been interviewed for a couple of jobs that were completely appropriate to put me on edge, because the job is 90% stress. I'm guessing, just based on your names and how I know some of you, we are not working in military service. We are not doing brain surgery. We're not doing high stress occupations. When I talk about high stress, I mean really high stress. So for the most part, we want to get people who are highly committed to building the value of the organizations together. And that's where we need to keep our focus. So if you're making them feel like they're sitting in front of like a horrible, this kind of attack checklist mode, it's not going to be a productive interview.
And on the flip side of things, maybe we could switch now to letting people go. Some thoughts on that? Firing people.
And I know some of you are also really good at hiring. So maybe now is the time to, like, if you have some tips or disagree with things I said, like, feel free to do it. I think I used to call myself at the brewery, I didn't like I'm not a big person on titles, so I didn't go by the VP thing, but I call myself cultural curator, because I think in a lot of ways, whether it's evaluations or hiring people, what we're really doing is trying to conjure conditions that allow for excellence, and we're trying to curate things. And if you're looking as an art curator, you're making sure the lighting in the building and the walls and the things are shining on things so they can be their best. And I think 90% of the time human resources is doing that. 10% of the time we're working on accountability and accountability in terms of like moving someone out of an organization. If your company's HR is spending 10% on or 50% of their time policing the organization, either something's wrong with your HR system or something's wrong with your company. HR, that's a very conventional corporate approach to HR, is we're going to spend most of our time policing people. In our organizations, I think we're completely capable where that role, whatever set of people or person is doing it, can take on the role of we're empowering, and we're trying to create conditions, not just situations. We're trying to create long-term conditions that empower people. I can tell you a story since everybody's being so quiet. I met an HR person for another brewery, not here in Colorado, so don't try to figure out who it is. But we went out, a bunch of us HR for brewery people, which have unique, if you're working in the alcohol industry, that's a whole other discussion. But we all went out to dinner just to chat and compare notes. And this other person, all she could talk about was how many write-ups they were giving for attendance. And I was like, that's all you do as an HR person, really, is like monitor to see if people are 2 minutes late for work. And to me, that just seemed miserable. And so, attendance at work is a thing, and we do need to show up on time. But if that's your biggest priority, there's something more fundamentally wrong in the system that's causing that. And that's where I think system thinking really comes into play, is if you start seeing these trends of issues and behaviors in the company, that's a cultural thing. Culture is the pattern of attitudes and actions. So if you see those patterns skewing towards these unhelpful things, it means we have an issue between our actual culture and our aspirational culture. And that's where you need to spend your time, is what's going on there.
So we've got about just under 20 minutes left. I wonder if we want to spend some time talking about firing, letting people go.
Yes. Oh, I'm going to share my screen here. This is actually from a book called Crucial Accountability from Vital Smarts. So they talk about content pattern relationship, CPR. And one, I love this because, I mean, you guys have probably already figured this out. Like, I love frameworks that people can remember, because if you can't remember it, you can't recite it, then you can't do it, right? So CPR. So content, we'll just stay on the attendance idea. So content is a one-time issue. I worked at a company that there was a train line that went by it. People were habitually late to work because they timed the train wrong. So these are content issues of like, wow, today, like, I just couldn't get here because I timed the train wrong. It's not really a performance issue, but it's probably something that a team or an individual wants to talk to someone about, like, hey, you were late. Is there a problem? Do you need help? What's going on? It's like, oh, no, not a problem. Just that it's just happened today. I just missed the train. And so this is obviously for like shift jobs or things where people need to have precision timing, because somebody can't leave until somebody else gets there. So you kind of understand the impact of like, wow, I was late, and so I caused somebody else to be late because they couldn't leave until I got there. So you build in, if somebody doesn't understand why it's important, you start talking about it here. Pattern is exactly that, a pattern. So I'll just stay on using the attendance example. Like, wow, you've been late like 3 times. We talked about this the other time, but now it seems like it's a pattern. What's going on here? And again, that person's allowing themselves to self-correct, but then also the conversation becomes a little bit more stern, I guess, of like, if this pattern continues, it's going to really be a problem for our team, because Jen can't leave until you get here. And so this pattern is a problem and we need to see it fixed. And that's the conversation. And that might even warrant like a recap email or something saying like, hey, we talked about this pattern today. You said you understood, blah, blah, blah. The relationship level is a pretty big deal, because it's where people are starting not to be able to trust the person that they're working with. We talked about this pattern of absences. Jen's missed her children's sports things because you've been late so much that we don't think we can count on you anymore. And this is really at the relationship level, is where you're really thinking about having to exit the person from the team or the organization. So it's a pretty stern place. And so for the vast majority of performance issues, they're probably going to follow this pattern of, and again, like, if somebody is late, don't immediately move to the relationship level. This acronym is to help address the issue at the right level. So if somebody's late for work and somebody like explodes on them and says, wow, I can't trust you because they were late one time, that's going to lead to a different kind of toxic environment, because I don't know if you guys realize this, but we're all not perfect. I have not met, I honestly don't think I've met anyone who genuinely wants to wake up in the morning and fail. And I've also never met anyone who's like perfect. So I think we have to allow for those imperfections. We have to allow for the conversations. But so if somebody has that kind of one-time content, it's just an in the moment issue, and somebody really like kind of gets emotionally charged by it, I think we have to kind of look at that person, like, is that person okay? So this helps address the issue at the appropriate level. And it also sets the stage for creating a more compassionate approach to exiting somebody from the company. A lot of companies, especially bigger companies, are classic, back to the HR as a cop. They're policing things. My daughter works for a major like corporation, and she told me she was going to have to let somebody go because they had reached they were given like 3, can't remember what she called, like exceptions. And once you met the 3 exceptions, you were automatically fired. So no consideration into what was happening with that person, no consideration into this person in other parts of their job was actually a really high performer. So this acronym helps lead to those kinds of conversations of, wow, if we're at the relationship level and I don't think that we can trust working with each other again, that's at the point you really need to think about exiting the discussion or the organization. In the best cases, which I wish happened more, people would be self-identifying that they shouldn't be there when you go through this process. And I have had that happen to me before, but not as much as I would like to have it happen to me, of like, wow, like this just isn't going to work for me. And then you can mutually agree to separate, and then it becomes a supportive arrangement where the company can actually kind of help that person, or it leaves things open for recommendations. But the termination, it also kind of sets the stage for that, of like we've been having this discussion. So again, no surprises. What this doesn't apply to are those critical situations. Somebody stealing, harassment issues, I'm trying to, safety violations that are really critical. There's certain things that need to be addressed in the moment and need to be addressed like firmly. But I really hope, I really believe for most businesses that is a pretty rare circumstances where somebody would have such a big issue that they would need to be exited and walk to the door almost immediately because of that. So there's those things. And again, here's the rule of documentation. If it's not documented, it didn't happen, because the worst case when you're terminating, I've had this happen over and over again. A manager comes and says like, hey, I got to fire this person. They're just not working out. Like, okay, then why aren't they working out? Well, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, did you talk to him? Yeah, I talked to him. Well, what'd they say? And then you get clear that there hasn't really been a structured accountability around it. So recapping things is just like a summary of agreements at that pattern level. Like at the pattern level, we agreed X, Y, and Z. And it's really great when the individual actually sends a recap. If you have managers in your structure, the individual, at the end of that pattern conversation, the manager saying, hey, will you just send me a recap of what we just talked about? And them putting that action into saying like, this is the agreements, it actually puts the responsibility on their shoulders, not the responsibilities on the shoulders of the manager. And so that's what ultimately we're still trying to drive for here, is a very responsible culture of where I'm making commitments to you. I'm recapping my commitments to you. I'm able to evaluate myself. I'm able to ask for what I need, and these kinds of things. So the attendance issue is a fairly like linear one, but I think it even works better in things that aren't quite as linear. Somebody, like for example, I had a gentleman, we were moving from manual work to human machine interfaces, HMI. And he had I'll tell you that I won't jump right to the ending, but he wasn't performing. Like he just wasn't working on the machines. Like the processes were all wrong. And so it's like, hey, did you know you got this? He's like, I got it. Then the pattern came up. And so then it ends up coming to HR. And what we learned in this process was he had a reading disability, and he couldn't ask for what he needed because he was ashamed and embarrassed. So when we said, you need to go back and say like, what do you need? What are your commitments? He said, actually, what I need is, can I get support? And we ended up sending him to a local community college. And that was part of the commitment that he made, is he would attend those, and we would get his reading comprehension level up at least enough to be able to understand what the machine said, so that he could be successful in work. And so I think that's just a good story of that. I've also had a situation where somebody had short-term memory loss, and I didn't realize it until they got into the performance accountability stage of they just couldn't remember because of a brain injury. So these are opportunities where people can have very humane solutions to situation if you have the discussion about them. So the recap, when the individual takes that on of, here's the commitments that I make to you, and here's the commitments I need from the business or my coworkers, whatever context it is. And these aren't fancy forms. It really is just, it can be an email between people of, these are the commitments. Then if you ever get to the situation, and hopefully you never get to the situation where a lawyer gets involved, you have the documentation of they made these commitments to me, they failed to keep them, and so we had to separate. It's a pretty straightforward, clear line if you ever have to get to that place where that, and I hope for you that doesn't, but unfortunately it does happen to even the best of us where that comes up. So it is creating a documentation process, but I think more importantly, it's creating dialogue and commitments and centering around this idea of more of a responsibility culture that preserves human dignity and creates conditions of responsibility. Just hopefully you feel that theme running through all of these very tactical issues. Come on, Larry, I know you have a question for me. I'm looking at you. You're muted.
And I just want to note, yeah, we have about 10 minutes, a little under. So really, this is the time. Any specific question you have, we've kept open this time. And or Jen, feel free to just switch into any kind of more overview thoughts that you have, leaving thoughts for everybody. Thanks.
Well, Jen, I'm just thinking something off the top of my head. I'm always curious about just how, especially in the employee-owned, we're all together, we're all in a financial family, so to speak. How do you resolve conflict? And the HR is just a kind of a conflict, which I really find fascinating, the structures, because I just know so little about it. But do you ever, here's my general question, which is what I do, but do you ever get, and I guess the answer is documentation, but he said, she said kind of things.
Oh yeah.
Is the answer then just documentation, like you just went through, just having people recap, having, when you do have a real difference in perspective between.
Yeah. I think that's a really great question, a really hard answer, because when I look back over the course of my career, I feel like I've let more people go from employment due to lack of self-awareness than anything else. So
Wow.
You get to that point where people have also had it's just, you get to that point where it really is perspective and you can't resolve it. And for whatever reason, there's just not that self-awareness to be able to have that growth mindset and to be able to correct. And so, at some point you have to say, this isn't serving the business. And that, to me, that's the ultimate arbiter in all of these issues, is we always need to think about what our business needs. And one of the books I love is The Advantage. I don't know if any of you guys have read it. But it's what's the biggest priority? And I think that it can get misunderstood in employee-owned companies as, why does the business exist? The business exists for our customers and for our markets. And so we all, as individuals and partners and collaborators in this business, need to keep pushing ourselves to support the growth of the business and support the values and all the things, the framework that we've put into it. And if at some point that doesn't work anymore, we need to get comfortable with parting ways. And sometimes in a good way, this can actually come, like somebody's career has reached the pinnacle of what it can reach inside your business. And then they need to leave if their career goals, their personal goals are to do that, and the business isn't serving their personal goals. That's okay to say. It's okay to say, I need to move on because I have pursuits that are more important to me than are within this business. But as long as we're within this business, we have to make that our priority. But then at the other level of conflict too, that's a much more complicated answer for me. But this is where I think when businesses invest in social emotional intelligence training, I think is really important, because people can't engage in productive conflict unless they have that social emotional awareness. Because then conflict just becomes angry disputes. And we need creative tension in businesses to push ideas higher. But that's where I think that role of that is really, really important. And sometimes and I actually feel more adamant about these in our modern modern times. That makes me sound like super old. Back in the day when I was riding my horse to work. No, but today I don't think humans know how to have conflict. And I genuinely worry about, the next generation coming in, because we see conflict as whatever battle we're having on Facebook or Twitter. And we have this way of anonymizing ourselves to be able to engage in this conflict. And that just doesn't work in the workplace. And so I think more and more as businesses come together, we are going to have to invest more in social emotional intelligence. We're going to have to create frameworks that show people and teach conflict, because it's not a natural skill. If you look at my conflict style assessment, we did these with the Beyster Institute for boards of directors. I'm more of a diplomat. So I'm going to try to find the best answer for everybody first. And then there's other people that are actually highly competitive and go straight to conflict because they're going to win no matter what it is. They're going to win that argument. So I think there's a multitude of knowing your conflict style, knowing what you're at, making sure that the organization has powerful social emotional intelligence, and then creating frameworks for conflict. I love creating some conflicts just to get people practice at it, of like polarizing safe issues, not like don't polarize political issues. That's bad. That goes nowhere fast. But, if there's an idea in an organization, polarize the two ideas and have people come together and create a better solution. So create safe spaces so people can practice debate and not just debating whether A is wrong and B is right, but how can we build these into better ideas for our business through the process of conflict. But you hit on, I think, a really good point, Larry, that it's one of my fears is as time moves on and we get so used to our virtual lives and get really comfortable there, will we know how to engage in creative conflict and even creative destruction? I think that might even be more important, is like, when do you know as a business your product is dated and you need to go ahead and let your pride go and destroy a particular product or service because you have to innovate. And I think that'll be in employee-owned firms. That's especially hard because we get really attached to the stuff we do because we made it. So I think, it's wonderful. We take so much pride that we made it, and that's good. And then when will the time come that we have to destroy it because we have to make something new? And that's a reality for any business.
I'm going to share a screen quickly here as we wrap up. Thanks everyone for being here. There was one last question from Andrew that we didn't get to. One quick thought on that, Jen, if you saw that. But mostly I think we should wrap up so everyone can get rolling. Kind of just what are the most important HR issues for companies transitioning from non-employee ownership to employee ownership?
I think the most important issue is identifying what this idea of organizational citizenship, because in non-EO, it's a job, and we can still belong to wonderful values and mission-oriented companies, but with employee-owned, we need to help people understand what the burden, and I mean burden in a good way, we're going to carry something more profoundly than maybe we did when we didn't own the company. So what does that look like? This is where I love Chris Mackin's Ownership Associates. I have a write-up on that I could send to, if I've never sent it to Amy and Ashley, I can, but the rights and responsibilities of employee ownership. So as an employee owner, I have rights. Too many rights can lead to entitlement. So every right needs to be balanced with a responsibility. And so those things create the ideas of organizational citizenship. And so Chris's model is one of my favorite models of, if I feel like I have a right to do X, then what are my responsibilities on that same thing? Where do I need to participate? And then where do I need to back out? What aspects of influence should the employee owners have? Because you don't want your democracy to slow down the business. You want your democracy to improve it. And so, how do you design systems of influence to make it go fast and be innovative and be exciting for your customers? Is that helpful? Oh, did you learn anything new about employee ownership? Love that question.
One of our standards. Well,
Well,
thank you.
thank you all for attending. I thank you guys for, I know we have screen fatigue, but it's always, for me, it's helpful, not that it's all about me, but it's helpful when people put their faces on. I've been watching Andrew smile and nod, and I've been watching Larry and then Joe, I don't know if you go by Joe Bob or Joe, but I've been watching you, and of course Amy and Ashley. So I understand screen fatigue, so I'm not guilting anybody who didn't want to turn their camera on, because I have screen fatigue a lot of the time too. And I also want to give my appreciation for you guys for turning your cameras on, because it's really helpful to see like nodding and, you know, the faces give us communication to know what we're doing. It's nothing like talking into a blank screen.
Thanks very much, Jen. This is great.
Thank you. Oh, hi, Tammy. See your smiling face. Love it.
Well, thanks again, everybody, for being here. As we mentioned in the chat, we'll send out this recording a couple days after today. And Jen, we had one request to see if you'd be willing to share some of the slides and images.
Yeah, you
that
can
put up. So
you can share. You guys have it, I think. I'll send you
Great.
my take on Chris Mackin's model too. So maybe we could share those things. But yeah, we'll see. But hopefully we'll get to see you guys in person at some point. I know Amy's been toying around with some kind of event, and the Colorado Commission's been toying around with it too. So hopefully there's an opportunity that we get to hang out together in person sometime this fall in Colorado, and we can see each other in person.
great.
Much,
Okay,
everybody, for being on, and have a great rest of your day.
thanks, everybody.
Thank you.